stage Terry Khalil, CEO and founder at Cyber Kaleidoscope. Terry will be presenting ICS Security. Can you set it and forget it? Establishing an ICS Cybersecurity compliance program.
Good morning. So this talk today on compliance will wake you up if you're not awake. So I'm really happy to be here, and looking for the thing here. All right. So can you set it and forget it? Well, I don't think you can, but how many of you have an ICS environment that never changes? The people never change, the devices never change, the settings never change, and so on. Does anyone have an environment that never changes? I was talking to an engineer that built or had something to do with building one of the power plants in Florida, and I asked him that question, and he said, I think you're right. And then he said, well, wait a minute, there was a device that we did pretty much set and forget, and we used to check it on the annual walkthrough. But he said, one day I decided to open the cabinet. It was a rusty old cabinet, and it was gone. So, and he didn't even realize it had disappeared. So, things do change. So, compliance landscape, and one of the reasons why I wanted to do this talk is going to be good whether you are establishing a brand new compliance program. Maybe you got a new regulation suddenly, like some of us that got the TSA pipeline security directives. And maybe you had to spin things up pretty quickly if you weren't already, maybe doing electric. Or if you already have a compliance program and you're just looking for tips, so hopefully you can get some tips today that'll help you out. But, and I realize a lot of these are US focused, but globally we've just got a lot of signaling about the compliance landscape. So for example, you have a lot of frameworks that already exist, ranging from the ISA/IEC 62443, which we've heard a lot about, the NIST 800-82, which is tied to the 853. And then we've had, a couple of years ago, we had the National Security Memorandum, and more recently, the National Security Strategy, which has, I believe, over 60 initiatives listed in it around security. And then CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency, had also come out with not only a strategic plan for 2024 through 2026, but also more recently an implementation guide, which I forgot to put on there. And then if you contract with the federal government, you probably have some contracts somewhere that have a clause in it that state that you need to meet DFARS cybersecurity as well. And if you've got that, then then eventually, a lot of people are self-assessing, but eventually you'll have to have a third party come in to do the CMMC, which is the Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification. So there's just a lot of things coming, and then there's a lot of things that are tied to that that can help you with the compliance program. Whether it's on the IT side, COBIT, or the NIST risk management framework, which can help you with any of it. And then, of course, we'd heard a few people talk today about the Idaho National Labs consequence-informed engineering, this cybersecurity-informed engineering and the consequence-driven cyber-informed engineering. And then in critical infrastructure, for a very long time now, about I would say 14 years or so, and it existed as a voluntary guideline before, but we have the NERC Critical Infrastructure Protection Cybersecurity Reliability Standards specific to the electric industry, which is my background. I was 13 years with an electric company down in Florida that also owns 2 gas companies. So that's a very specifically created standard. And then now you also have the Department of Homeland Security cross-sector compliance performance goals. And those are aimed at critical infrastructure, but anyone can use those. And again, they're voluntary. They're going to focus on chemical, water, and the rest of the energy infrastructure first. But what we generally see is when things are voluntary, eventually they become not voluntary anymore. So You might want to be proactive and start looking at some of these. It probably doesn't matter which ones you pick at first. Just pick one. And also remember that these standards and frameworks may not be everything that you need to do in your environment, but they can help you. And then if you do have other things that you're doing, you could make them also part of your compliance program, because your compliance program kind of has your back from a security perspective, right? Trying to help you go back and assure that things are compliant and even audit ready. So how do you get started? So if you've got to spin this up really fast, you've really got to start penciling things in fast if you don't have anything. You really need a governance structure, and you might have things within your company that you can leverage. If you've already got a regulatory affairs department because you have regulations, whether it's environmental or what have you, you may be able to leverage some of those programs to get ideas. You may have a company-level compliance team or committee. And then, of course, you've got a code of business conduct, which probably states somewhere in there that you have to meet all the laws and regulations. But it's not going to be your cybersecurity-focused IT and OT type of compliance program. What I like to do is have sort of 3 levels. One is that senior officer level sponsorship, and then a director level steering committee or council, or whatever you want to call it. And then the working group, which is your subject matter experts, and then your leads and managers and so on. So some formation of that. And generally, again, what I like to do is usually start from the bottom when it comes to the SMEs, because that's usually what you know. But when you set it up, you can write up a charter with a mission and purpose, all the things that kind of give some structure to it and get that consensed and reviewed. You're usually going to do that at the manager and director level initially, and then kind of go around and get some buy-in and sign off to it. Well, how do you figure out your stakeholders? I think most of you kind of know that for most of them. Maybe your organization is global, or maybe you have multiple affiliates. So you're going to look at your geography and then how your organization is functionally organized, who needs to be in play. If you look at the requirements of the framework or the regulation that you have to meet, you'll start to see, and you'll want to maybe make a list of those requirements and start penciling names in. Okay, Joe probably can run with the patching, Alice can run with the anti-malware, and so on. And eventually you're going to plug in the manager and the directors and whoever's over them from a senior sponsorship perspective. But also keep in mind that there are people that need to be involved that aren't going to be the ones doing the work. So you probably already know who some of those are. It might be legal, it might be some other groups, but there's also those people, and you probably know who they are. They're the people that may not be doing the work. They may not be a manager or a lead, but they're what I would call an opinion leader. If you've ever had the Vital Smarts influencer training, they're kind of like almost silently influencing. It might be that person, they're kind of quiet for a while, but everyone in the room is just kind of waiting for whatever the signal is from that person that they're on board, and then they'll get on board. Anybody have someone like that? We definitely have a couple people like that. So you want to make sure you're getting their buy-in and asking questions and doing this in a collaborative way, because if the compliance team sits down and writes all the processes and does all the documents and everything and hands it to the SME and says, here's what you need to do, you are not going to have a good time after that. So this is probably all going to start out as a project. So this will be your project committees, but then you'll be transitioning it to something more permanent and sustainable and have an ongoing plan around that. And part of that, you really need not only a RACI or some sort of list of roles and responsibilities to help with accountability, and that's not the only thing. There's a couple of different styles. The one at the top is sort of a more traditional RACI matrix. RACI is responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. So you kind of take the different responsibilities in meeting the requirements, list them out, put the role names across the top. Accountable, there really should only be one person, and responsible, there's usually only one person. But when it comes to these frameworks, I like to start with sort of a modified RACI, which is the one on the bottom, where you list all the requirements and sub-requirements. Who is this me, the main SME, and who is their manager or lead? And then, if there's other people involved, put them in the other columns. So you start penciling those in, and as you go, you'll finally get consensus and agreement of who's responsible. But then you have those requirements that sort of require someone that has their eye on developing the program, the process, the procedure, hand in hand with the compliance team or whoever is assigned to deal with the regulation or the framework from an overall perspective. And then you're going to have, maybe it's a requirement that involves multiple devices or device types. So let's take an easy one I say easy to conceptualize, patching. So you're probably going to have one person that's responsible for the process and helping monitor different things and tools. And then you're going to have whoever's responsible to do upgrades on switches, or whoever's responsible for Windows, for Linux, and you might have multiple teams and groups. So one thing to keep in mind in a situation like that is this person responsible for the process and some escalation is usually a peer of the people doing the work. So that kind of puts them in a tough position. So it gives them a chance to be a leader and show some leadership things, maybe without having the title, but it also can make it very awkward. So that's one of the challenges that I had with the program. There were a couple of people that had a hard time with that. So that's just one thing you need to consider. In terms of most of your companies, you probably have some sort of that might be my phone. You can just turn my phone off if you want back there. I'm sorry. So a lot of your companies have maybe a positive discipline policy where, if someone has a behavior or performance issue, there's a path that you walk down. I do not recommend that for something like a regulation, unless it's a pattern of repeated performance, regardless of whether it has something to do with compliance. I would never advise using something like that. If we get a violation and we have to self-report it, then you're going on positive discipline. That is just not something that drives the right behavior. You're going to wind up with people hiding things. And that's not what you want. You want people to speak up when you're out of compliance so that you can get it fixed and move on. And yes, with some regulations, that moving part takes some time because you have to spend a lot of time investigating, but don't drive that wrong behavior. Okay, a lot of information on this slide, and I did it this way on purpose because you got to think about all these things, and a lot of it gets done in parallel. So one of the key things, and we've heard this in a few talks this week, is why are we doing this? So make sure that you're explaining this over and over and over. And that's part of organizational change management, which is an entire topic that is even part of an MBA program. There's multiple methodologies. Doesn't really matter which one you pick. They're all pretty similar. The idea is that you are letting people know, hey, this is coming, it's going to impact you, hey, it's going to impact you this way, and this is what the benefits are, and this is what's in it for you. And you're going to have to use stories. We heard that from a few people too. And I call it awaring is not caring. So you've got to not just give the awareness, but give some stories on why it's important. So this is all about the pathos, getting the emotions involved. You don't have to scare people, but make it real for them. So then you're going to move into this sort of, well, how are we going to do it? And if this is new, sometimes you're going to set up a process. When it's a regulation, you may have a process that's more audit-facing. It's high level. It covers just enough for what the auditors need to see to know that you are doing this. But you may have other things that are more detailed. So with some regulations, if you put it all in the audit-facing process, they will audit you on all of that. So you kind of need to strike that balance. So it's going to take the SMEs to collaborate, and the standards are not written in the way that you do business on a day-to-day basis, right? They're just written to say, hey, you've got to do this, and you've got to consider all your Windows assets, Linux, all your non-Windows, non-Linux devices. And for some of them, you've got to look at the various layers, whether it's the operating system, the database application, and so on. So you've got to have your SMEs to collaborate on that. And then you're going to come up with training. And then a lot of this is just kind of more about sustaining the program. And I think it would take a long time to go through this. I could probably make a whole day out of just this slide. But anything from putting together some training on an LMS, doing lunch and learns, anything to keep your SMEs involved. They're not in all of this every day like you are. They're not really thinking about the NotPetya's and all those things that happen like all of you are thinking about every day. So you just kind of want to keep them in the know without overwhelming them. And the other piece of this, and it goes back to the accountability piece as well, is you need to find a way to make sure that the people that are doing the work will do the work, because they've already got a lot on their plate. And here's the compliance person saying, here, you got to do all this other work. And they might tell you, it's not a priority for me. So you've got to engage their directors early, and you've got to make sure those directors are letting their people know that this is what we're going to be doing this month, this year, whatever it is. So it should be department goals, performance goals, whatever it takes in your company, that people will prioritize it and get it done. And then there's some dimensions of security culture, which ties into this. I heard someone else say this week, you don't have a separate security culture, it's your organization culture. I agree with that. But there are some tidbits in a book that I referenced there by Carpenter and Rohr. All right, so interpreting the standards is often a very challenging thing. So on the one hand, sometimes you prefer for the standards to not be so prescriptive. But on the other hand, when they're vague, then you're kind of like, well, if we do this, is it going to be acceptable? And you go through all those discussions, and a lot of companies wind up taking a very conservative approach to make sure that they're compliant. But you have to look at every noun and every verb in the requirement. Maybe it says evaluate, track, and implement. Okay, so make sure your process says how you evaluate, and then how you track, how you implement, and then whatever, implement A, B, and C, how you do A, how you do B and C. And then again, for some things that might be, say, device related, how you do the different types of platforms, or how you authenticate, internally, remote, and so on. A lot of times with these things, there's terminology, definitions, guidance out there. You want to take a look at all of that. It's not necessarily part of the standards, but you should do that. And then with certain regulations, they require a compliance narrative, which is how you comply. A little bit different than, so you come up with all these processes, program documents, performance evidence, and so on. But the auditors are coming in. They go to a lot of different environments. They don't know your environment. So the narrative's really just like a Google map to your compliance, to your environment, or the playbook. So you're going to walk through saying, okay, for evaluate, track, and implement, you're going to go to this document, go to section whatever, page whatever, and here's where it says this, and so on. So you're going to really step by step in the narrative. And I recommend doing that as part of your projects. Not only the documentation, but the narratives, because you will find things that you didn't realize you needed to do when you do that sort of final walkthrough. And then the compliance math. You didn't know you were going to do math in compliance, right? But in NERC SIP, there is a standard that says to evaluate patches within 35 days and then implement in 35 days. So you might take a quick look at that and think, oh, I've got 70 days. You don't have 70 days. You evaluate within 35 days. Let's say you did it within 5. Then you have 35 from that 5th day to implement. So be careful with the compliance math. And of course, it depends how it's enforced. There's some requirements that say do it every 30 days. You might think that's once a month. Well, wait a minute, some months have 31 days, so how are we going to deal with that? Okay, this is sort of a start at your project management plan. I'm not going to go through all of it. Some of it's pretty standard stuff, but a couple of key things. Don't forget to include all the process documentation and all of that and the performance evidence in the requirements, because some of that evidence will be maybe an extract, maybe a report, and those all need to be designed, coded, extracted, whatever it is. And then you also are going to need design workshops for some of these things. You may have like a home project and then sub-projects to handle it to just kind of make it easier to deal with. So you'll need to carefully design the design workshops so that when you bring in 30 people or however many people you've got to involve, that you're going to have a smooth, productive, effective half day or whatever it's going to be. So you'll need a little core team to figure out what decisions are we going to have to make. Someone that really sits down, does that critical analysis, and says, okay, I think we're probably going to go this direction, but we could do this, so okay, that's a decision. So you're going to have to plan for those design workshops. The other thing I wanted to call out is you're not compliant till you're compliant. So just because you put in a technology to manage your asset inventory or to patch or to do network segmentation, you're ready to do it, but you didn't do it yet. You've got to get that inventory in there with all the required attributes, all the attributes that are going to help you run your program. You've got to do your first phase of patching. You've got to do some zones. You've got to set up some zones for your segmentation. So don't forget that operationalization has to be part of your project. Okay, so what do we do if we go out of compliance? We've met all the requirements, we set up, we've got evidence. And by the way, on the evidence, make sure you come up with a very good naming convention for your evidence, a centralized location, and a way to sort of have someone at a manager or lead level kind of sign off on that evidence each time. You know, maybe it's a monthly thing that you have to do. So you're going to create some sort of artifact, and the SME will put that in the site, and then a manager will say, okay, looks good, and then someone can check off that, hey, we did that. And then you also will need a, not necessarily a tool. I mean, some people use spreadsheets, which is a little challenging. Some people use maybe a SharePoint site with an associated list that has some workflows associated with it to send out reminders to say, hey, it's time to do your compliance thing. And then if you don't do it, then you can use the views to do the escalation. Just figure out something that you can rely on, that you can have an escalation process to let management know, hey, this didn't get done. We're about to go out of compliance. If you set up a good naming convention to make things easy to find that's not 20 clicks down into a site, that'll make it easier for everyone. If you go out of compliance, you want to make sure you've encouraged your folks to let you know. You will have in your project hopefully put in some detective controls to flag you if something is about to go out of compliance, if you can figure out a way to do that. But if you do go out of compliance, to flag that exception as soon as possible, because the sooner you can get back in compliance, the better. For example, let's say you have a requirement to remove access within 24 hours, and you have a control, or sorry, let's say you have a requirement to have a background check and training before you grant access. So your system, where you enter the access request in, should stop you from even being able to submit that request if you don't have those two prerequisites in place. And then on the back end, if it somehow does actually get provision, either through maybe giving it to the wrong ID or what have you, that you get an exception report or some sort of flag. So you've got, that's a lot of programming on the back end with some reporting and so on to do that. So design those preventive and detective controls in the requirements. When you go out of compliance, you'll need to set up a process for that. How is it discovered? Who do you tell? How do you investigate? How do you write up the information? And when you investigate, you're probably going to want a timeline. You'll need to do a root cause analysis. There's a lot of ways to do that. We used to do one called the 5 whys. Why did this happen? Okay, then why did that happen? And so on and so forth. And if you go at least 5 levels, you can usually get to the root cause. Sometimes you might have multiple root causes. You'll also want to look at, well, how bad was it? Was it just this one thing? Or was it like across the board? So that's called an extent of condition. It doesn't always have to be done up front because maybe you can already tell, okay, this is really bad. We just completely misinterpreted this requirement and we learned something from another entity, and you can kind of go based on that and make that a step in your mitigation plan. But if you know, okay, we checked, we just found 3 more, then you can include it there. And then you'll come up with your mitigation plan. And again, you're working with SMEs on all this. You're working with the person that found it. You're working with anybody that is going to have to do the work. So sometimes the mitigation plan is going to require someone to do the work that has nothing to do with the regulation. So again, maybe the programming team, maybe someone in infrastructure or networking. So make sure that they're part of designing that. So you have to correct whatever the problem was. And make sure you've addressed the root cause and any other causes that you found. Add a preventive control. Every time you get one that's out of compliance, you really need a better preventive control. And then some sort of communication and training type of control. And you may identify other things that you need to do that you don't want to necessarily put in your formal mitigation plan. You can design those, but keep them separate. And then there's usually some sort of process to submit that to the regulator, whether it's a self-report or an action plan, what have you. All right, speaking of reporting, and we're getting really close on time, you want to make sure that you're talking about your compliance program to all levels of management and on some periodic basis, even to the officers, even if it's just once a year. Maybe you have an update to the board. Maybe that update gets mixed in with a regulatory update or an overall security posture update. Wherever it is, you want to make sure that you're doing that, because otherwise, well, we're not hearing anything. Do you guys really need that many people? So you don't want to, you worked really hard for the head count. I'm pretty sure none of you have enough people. You don't want to lose anybody. So make sure you're talking about it. And below are some different ideas. You can talk, especially with the people that are more in the weeds, talk about your current activities, talk about how that upgrade to EMS, or your SCADA system is going to impact, different artifacts that you might have for compliance. Talk about how some org change is going to impact, or building a new facility. Maybe you're building a brand new operations center, so there's going to be a lot of impacts there. Or maybe you've had some non-compliance issues. Management always wants to know, well, why did it happen? What are the trends? What are the patterns? How can we prevent it? How much is this going to cost us? And then sometimes penalties might be financial, but sometimes they might be additional oversight. So maybe you get spot audits, or maybe you get into like required reporting to the board on a more frequent basis and so on. And make sure that you're looking at revisions to the regulations, or if you've selected a voluntary framework, revisions to that, and start thinking about, well, what is that going to look like in our company? Which parts of this change are going to affect us, and start drawing up a budget. And if you have to, just put in a number. It doesn't really matter what number, but you can usually figure out how much it's going to cost. So you can get that awareness in there so that you're not surprised when you've got to go out and buy 10 more firewalls or implement some sort of risk management system or what have you. And then for sustainability, make sure that you're doing proactive monitoring to see if you've got problems. Make sure things are getting validated in projects. I know in some frameworks there's like an authorization to operate, so a lot of review by the compliance team prior to going into production, things like that. All right, that's all I have for you. Thank you. Any questions? kind of know I'm running up on time, so. Any questions? If this didn't address what you thought it was going to address, please make sure you come up to me later today. I'll be happy to try to answer your questions.
Yeah, I have a question.
Okay.
I would assume that when you're putting this together that you would probably want to make sure that you document that you've got a couple non-compliance issues, because I would think that a third-party auditor come in initially, if you didn't find any, they'd go, okay, you're probably not going deep enough. So you want to make sure that you have those and the mitigation process is there to kind of make them happy, so to speak, to show that you're actually doing your work. Is that correct?
Yeah, I agree. If you're not finding anything, then you need, you're either hiding it or
Not being effective?
you need to learn more about it and so on. You need more detective controls. So you should be finding things periodically.
Okay, thank you.